Nathan Cole had always trusted numbers more than he trusted people. Numbers did not flatter you. They did not apologize, and they never lied just to make you feel better. A beam either held its weight or it did not. A safety margin was either enough, or it was a problem waiting for the wrong afternoon to happen. He had built his whole life around that idea. Long before he understood, it was also a way of protecting himself from things he could not measure. He was a structural engineer, 40 years old, and for the last 4 years, he had been a widower, a word that still made the floor feel unsteady under him every time someone said it out loud in front of him. His wife, Rachel, had died of an illness no safety margin could have prepared him for. Since then, he had raised their daughter, Sophie, mostly by himself, using the same care he brought to his work. Spread the weight out, build in backup, never let one single point carry more than it could bear. What people who worked with Nathan rarely understood was how much of him Rachel's death had quietly closed off. He had always been careful with numbers. After Rachel, he became careful with people too, polite, thorough, reliable, and almost impossible to actually know. He did not talk about himself. He did not linger after meetings. He answered questions about load calculations for as long as anyone wanted and questions about his own life in as few words as he could manage. Colleagues respected him. Almost none of them would have said they knew him. He had given whatever was left of his heart, after Rachel, entirely to Sophie. She was not simply his daughter anymore. She was the one structure in his life he had decided, without ever quite saying so, that he would not risk losing anything else to build. It was the week of Sophie's 10th birthday when Nathan was hired as the independent reviewer on the Meridian Tower project, a 42-story building rising out of a downtown Miami construction site, like a promise the city had made to itself. His job was simple to explain and hard to do. Check, on his own, without help from the design team, whether the numbers behind that promise actually held up. That was how he met Elena Marsh. Elena was 35. She ran Marsh Development Group, and she carried herself like someone who had inherited not just a company, but a debt she still owed to everyone who doubted her. Her father had built a firm from nothing and nearly lost it twice, and when he retired, he had split its ownership the way he'd built everything else, carefully and not entirely in Elena's favor. Elena held the largest single share and the chief executive's chair, but the outside investors and the old board her father had assembled still controlled enough combined stock, under the bylaws he'd written, to force a leadership review if they lost confidence in her. It was, Elena had once told a colleague, a very elegant way for her father to make sure she would always have to keep earning the job rather than simply inheriting it. Elena had spent 6 years since then rebuilding what he'd left behind, and Meridian Tower was, from everything Nathan had heard before he even met her, the project that would either prove she belonged in that office or finish what her father's mistakes had started. She met him on site on a gray Tuesday morning. Her hard hat did not fit quite right, and her blazer looked like it belonged in a boardroom, not a construction trailer. She stood with her shoulders back and her chin level, the posture of someone who had learned the hard way that any hesitation gets read as weakness. Nathan noticed something else too, the way her eyes moved across the site before they landed on him. Quick, careful, checking for risk the same way he checked for load. They were, though neither of them would have admitted it that first morning, more alike than either wanted to know. She held out her hand. Her grip was firm and quick, no wasted motion. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I hear you're the hardest reviewer in the state to satisfy." "I've heard that too," Nathan said. Usually from people whose numbers didn't hold up. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one, the way a beam bends just slightly before it ever really moves. She tilted her head, studying him a second longer than she needed to. "Then we'll get along fine," she said. "My numbers hold up." Over the following weeks, Elena would learn that this was mostly true, and that the one place it wasn't true would nearly cost them both everything they had. The trouble started in October, during what should have been a routine check of the foundation pile testing, the record of how much weight each pile, driven into the ground beneath the tower, could actually be trusted to carry. Nathan sat in the site trailer with the soil report open on his laptop, running the same calculation twice, because the first answer wasn't one he wanted to believe. The soil data behind the foundation design was old. Nearly 3 years old, in fact, from before a late change added 2 more floors to the building, which meant a lot more weight for every pile underground to hold. Nobody had gone back to retest the soil after that change. The number the design was built on no longer matched the building it was supposed to hold up. In plain terms, the safety margin had quietly worn away to something Nathan could not sign off on. He sat with that for a long time before he told anyone. He had learned, since Rachel died, not to trust decisions made in a hurry, in the grip of feeling instead of fact. But this wasn't feeling. This was arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't get softer with time. He brought it to Elena first, just the two of them, in her office on the 31st floor of a brick-hell high-rise her own father had built 20 years before. She listened to the whole explanation without once cutting in. A rare thing, Nathan would learn, and one she only gave to people she'd already decided were worth hearing out. She sat very still while he talked, her hands folded on the desk, her eyes fixed on his the whole time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and she leaned back slowly in her chair. "How bad?" she said. "In dollars." "I don't measure this in dollars," Nathan said. "I measure it in consequences. If we keep pouring the rest of the foundation on this data, we're building 42 stories on an assumption that isn't true anymore. I won't sign off on it." Her jaw tightened. Not anger, Nathan understood later, but the tension of someone doing her own math, weighing numbers he had no way of seeing. Investors watching her every move, a board looking for any sign she was her father's daughter in the wrong way, a company that might not survive another delay. "If we stop pouring," she said, "we lose the season. We lose 2 years of investor trust we've been rebuilding one meeting at a time. Do you understand what you're asking me to risk?" "I understand what I'm asking you not to risk," Nathan said. "The building doesn't care about your investors." Elena looked at him for a long moment. He braced for anger. What he got instead was something closer to recognition. The look of someone who had just met a person who spoke a language she'd nearly forgotten she knew. Her shoulders dropped, just slightly, the fight going out of them. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it doesn't." What neither of them knew yet was that this problem had already been found once before, 18 months earlier, by Marcus Webb, Marsh Development's chief operating officer. Marcus had worked beside Elena's father since the company's earliest days, and in his own quiet way, he had decided that reporting the problem would cost him more than hiding it would. Marcus was not a cartoon villain. He was a tired, capable man who had spent 2 decades believing the company belonged to him as much as it belonged to the founder's daughter, and who had watched Elena rise to the top with a jealousy he had trained himself, mostly, not to say out loud. When the updated soil report landed on his desk showing the shortfall, he did his own private math, the cost of a delay against the cost of a weak foundation. He decided, alone, that the schedule would win. He filed the report where no one would find it, and told himself, the way people often do, that he was protecting the company, not endangering it. Neither Nathan nor Elena learned any of this until later. At the time, they only knew that when Nathan raised the problem formally, in a board meeting 3 days after his conversation with Elena, Marcus was the first person to speak, and the first to turn the conversation against him. Marcus stood halfway up from his chair, one hand flat on the table, and looked around the room instead of at Nathan. It was a small thing, but Nathan noticed it right away. The way a man avoids the eyes of the person he's about to attack, because looking straight at them makes the attack harder to finish. With respect, Marcus said, in the voice of a man performing confidence he didn't quite have, "Mr. Cole is paid by the week to find problems. Every week this review drags on is another invoice. I'd ask the board to consider the source before they consider the claim." A murmur moved around the table. Nathan felt his own hands go flat and still against the folder in front of him. Not a gesture he chose, just the automatic stillness of a man bracing under sudden weight. "The finding isn't mine to soften, Marcus," Nathan said. "The soil report is 3 years old. The tower gained 2 floors after it was written. Nobody retested. That's not an opinion I'm charging anyone for. That's a date on a document. A date on a document. Marcus almost smiled. The smile of a man who believes he's already holding the better hand. You know what else has a date on it, Mr. Cole? Every invoice you've submitted since August. Funny how the numbers keep finding new problems right up until the contract's due for renewal. If you think I'm inventing a shortfall in bearing capacity to keep collecting a fee, Nathan said, his voice level though something hot had started climbing his throat, then challenged the math. Not the invoice. Bring in your own engineer. Have them run the pile capacity against the current load and tell this board I'm wrong. I'll wait. Marcus's jaw worked once, a small involuntary motion, before he recovered his footing. This board doesn't need a second engineer to understand what a scheduled delay costs, he said, turning now to address the room instead of Nathan, one hand sweeping through the air as if pushing the whole problem aside. We're 6 weeks from the next investor draw. Halting the pour on the foundation isn't caution. It's a signal to every investor watching this project that Marsh Development can't manage its own construction. I've spent 20 years building this company's name. I'm not going to watch it undone because one consultant found a number he didn't like. I didn't find a number I didn't like, Nathan said. I found a number that doesn't hold the building up. Those aren't the same thing. I think you know that, or you'd be talking about piles instead of invoices. Something tightened in Nathan's chest. Not the clean strain of a loaded beam, but something messier and older. The particular sting of watching his integrity get twisted into a business strategy in front of people who didn't know him well enough to know better. He looked across the table at Elena. Her hands, folded in front of her, had gone completely still. Not calm, he realized, but held the way a person holds something she is afraid of dropping. Marcus, she said. Her voice was even, but Nathan could hear the strain underneath it, like a beam close to bending too far. Mr. Cole's finding is a matter of record. It isn't a matter of motive. Marcus turned to face her directly now, and something in his tone shifted, quieter, and for that reason harder to sit through. Your father built this company on relationships, Elena. 20 years of them. I was one of them before you were old enough to sit in these meetings. And in 6 months, you decided a stranger with a laptop knows this site better than the people who poured its foundation. The room went very still. Nathan understood, watching it happen, that this was no longer really about the soil report at all, that Marcus had been waiting a long time for a reason to say something like this to her in front of witnesses and had finally found one. This isn't about how long you've known my father, Elena said. Her voice didn't rise, but something underneath it had gone sharper, more exact, the tone of someone laying a number on the table and daring anyone to argue with it. It's about a load calculation that no longer matches the building we're pouring. If Mr. Cole is wrong, the math will show it. If you're so confident he's wrong, you should be the one asking for a second opinion, not asking this board to ignore the first one. I am asking this board, Marcus said, to remember who has actually delivered for this company and who's simply passing through it. He said it quietly, almost to himself, as if repeating it once more might make it truer. And something in the set of his mouth told Nathan that he had already decided how this story would end, with both Nathan and Elena written out of it. The weeks after that were some of the hardest of Nathan's career, and Marcus made sure of it. He took his version of events to a local business paper, painting Nathan as an engineer padding his bill with invented alarm, and Elena as a young CEO who had lost control of her own team. 2 board members, old friends of Elena's father, began quietly leaning toward a vote against her. Nathan carried none of it calmly. He lay awake more nights than he wanted to admit, gripped by the specific, gnawing fear of watching his name, the only real inheritance he had left to give his daughter, come under attack for the crime of telling the truth. It was a particular kind of anger that didn't shout. It just sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. He carried that stone through most of November, and he carried it the way he carried everything hard, alone, quietly, without asking anyone to help him hold it. Elena noticed this about Nathan long before she understood it. She noticed it the way she noticed structural things. A hairline cracked before anyone else saw it, a beam that deflected slightly more than the drawing said it should. Nathan answered every technical question at length and every personal one in a single sentence. He never stayed for the coffee after a site meeting. He never mentioned weekends or friends or anything that happened to him outside the boundary of the project. He was, in every way that mattered to a CEO, try to read a room, an easy man to trust and an impossible man to actually know. What she could not miss, because it happened in plain sight on the site almost every week, was Sophie. The girl showed up after school some afternoons, waiting in the trailer with her backpack and her homework, and something in Nathan changed the moment he was near her. His shoulders loosened, his voice dropped into something warmer, his whole guarded posture softened the way his structure settles once a load finally finds its proper path. Whatever Nathan had closed off from the rest of the world, he had clearly given all of it, without reservation, to his daughter. Elena found herself wanting to know why, and it was Sophie, in the end, who let her close enough to start finding out. It happened on an ordinary evening not long after, later than Elena's usual hour for site visits, after most of the crew had already gone home. She found Sophie alone in the trailer, cross-legged on a folding chair with a worksheet spread across the table, waiting for Nathan to finish a phone call outside. Elena hesitated in the doorway for a moment. She was not, by her own admission, a woman who knew what to do with children. And then, because the alternative was standing there awkwardly, she set her bag down and pulled up the chair across from Sophie instead. "What's that?" she asked, nodding at the paper. "A bridge," Sophie said, with the total seriousness kids say for things they've decided really matter. "I have to explain why it doesn't fall down. Can I see?" Sophie slid the paper across without a second thought, and Elena studied the drawing carefully, not the way adults usually humor a child, but the way she read a real report, her brow furrowed, one finger tracing the crude lines of the deck and the supports beneath it. Then she picked up a pencil and, gently, began showing Sophie how a bridge actually works. How it's really just an argument between weight and the things holding it up, an argument that has to be won at every single point, not just on average. Like teamwork, Sophie said. Exactly like teamwork. Something in Elena's voice went soft when she said it, softer than Nathan, listening from just outside the trailer door, had ever heard her sound in a boardroom. Sophie beamed at the compliment hidden inside the explanation, and without any warning at all, reached over and drew a small, lopsided bridge in the corner of Elena's notepad, right beside her columns of numbers. "That one's for you," Sophie said. "So you remember." Elena looked at the little drawing for a long moment, her thumb resting lightly over it, as if she were afraid pressing too hard might smudge it. "I will," she said, and something about the way she said it made it sound like a promise rather than a pleasantry. That became a habit over the following weeks, though neither of them ever said so out loud. Sophie started saving her drawings for Elena. Towers, bridges, one memorable treehouse that would never actually stand up, each one presented with the same solemn ceremony, spread flat on the table and narrated in careful detail. Elena, in turn, started bringing small things of her own, a bag of pretzels from the vending machine downstairs, a set of colored pencils. She'd noticed Sophie's were down to 3 broken stubs of a laminated hard hat sticker shaped like a tiny crane. Once, without being asked, she sat through an entire recitation of the solar system, offered by Sophie in the exact order the planets appeared in her science textbook, and nodded along as though she had never heard it before in her life. "You're really good at listening," Sophie told her one evening, apropos of nothing, swinging her feet under the folding chair. "Better than most grown-ups." "Most grown-ups are listening for what they want to say next," Elena said. "I'm trying to stop doing that." "Why?" Elena considered the question longer than its size seemed to warrant. "Because somebody did that for me once a long time ago," she said finally. "I didn't get much of it, so now I try to be the one who does." Sophie nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded at any answer that sounded true, and went back to her drawing, and Elena sat there while longer than the drawings required, watching a 10-year-old's pencil move across the page, feeling something in her chest loosen that had been pulled tight for longer than she could easily remember. Elena still wanted to know why. Watching Sophie with him was one thing. Understanding what had made Nathan the way he was underneath it was another. She asked him once, directly, on an evening in early November when the two of them were the last ones left in the trailer, the sight quiet outside, the light gone orange and then gray through the windows. She had been reviewing drawings beside him for over an hour, and something about the ease of the silence between them made her brave enough to ask. "Can I ask you something that isn't about the building?" she said. Nathan didn't look up right away. His pen kept moving across the page for another line before it stopped. "You can ask," he said. "You never talk about yourself. Not once in 2 months." She kept her voice light, careful not to make it sound like an accusation. "I know about Sophie. I know you're good at your job. I don't know anything else." Nathan's jaw tightened, the same way Elena's own did when she was protecting something she didn't want touched. He set his pen down with a small, deliberate motion, as if he needed both hands free to hold something steady. "There isn't much else worth knowing," he said. His voice was even, but flat in a way that closed the door as firmly as any raised voice could have. "I do the work. I raise my daughter. That's most of it." "That's not an answer," Elena said gently. "It's the one I've got," Nathan said, and he picked his pen back up, and the conversation, without either of them saying so out loud, was over. Elena did not push. She had learned, in 6 years of running a company built by a difficult man, that pushing on a closed door rarely opened it. It only taught the person on the other side to build the door a little heavier. But she also did not let it go. What Elena did instead, over the following 2 weeks, was something closer to due diligence than curiosity, though she would later admit to herself that it had never really been about the project at all. She was careful about it. A conversation with a mutual industry contact who had worked with Nathan years before, an old newspaper archive search on a slow evening at home, the kind of quiet research she would normally have run on a business partner before signing a contract worth her company's future. She told herself it was reasonable. She was not entirely sure that was true. What she found was a 4-year-old obituary, and beneath the plain, formal language of it, a story she had already half guessed at from the way Nathan held himself. A wife, an illness that had moved faster than anyone expected, a daughter who had been 6 years old when her mother died. A colleague, reached carefully and briefly, told Elena that Nathan had taken almost no time off after the funeral, had simply gone back to work within the month, and had never, in the years since, spoken about it to anyone at the office beyond the bare minimum required to explain why he sometimes left early to pick up his daughter from school. Elena sat with that for a long time in her apartment, the file closed in front of her. She understood, then, in a way she hadn't before, exactly what she was looking at every time she watched Nathan soften around Sophie and close around everyone else. He was not simply a private man. He was a man who had already lost the one thing he had built his whole life around, and who had rebuilt everything that remained, carefully, deliberately, the way he built everything, around the one thing he could not survive losing again. Sophie was not just his daughter. She was the last load-bearing wall in a structure that had already lost one, and Nathan had spent 4 years making absolutely certain nothing else would ever be asked to carry that kind of weight. Elena began watching Nathan and Sophie differently after that. Not with pity. She was careful, always, not to let it become pity, but with something gentler, something that recognized quietly that she was looking at a man who had built himself a very good, very lonely kind of safety. There was one evening, not long after, that Nathan would carry with him for a long time afterward, though he never told Elena exactly how much. He had come back into the trailer to grab a set of keys he'd forgotten and stopped short in the doorway, out of sight of both of them. Sophie was drawing quietly at the folding table while Elena sat beside her, going through a set of shop drawings. The two of them settled into the easy, wordless comfort of people who no longer needed to fill every silence. Without looking up, in that plain and devastating way kids ask the questions adults spend years avoiding, Sophie said, "Are you going to leave too? Like Mom did?" Nathan felt his whole body go rigid, a kind of alarm no engineering term could describe. He did not move. He did not trust himself to. He watched Elena set her pencil down carefully, the way a person sets down something breakable when their hands have suddenly gone unsteady. She turned her chair to face Sophie fully and reached over to gently tuck a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear before she answered. Her voice quieter than Nathan had ever heard it in a boardroom, quieter even than the voice she used late at night over the drawings. "I can't promise I'll never leave, Sophie," she said. "Nobody can promise that, honestly, and I don't think it's fair to pretend otherwise." She paused, and her hand stayed where it was, resting lightly against Sophie's shoulder now, steady. "But I can promise you I'll always tell you the truth, even when it's hard, especially then." Sophie thought about this with the seriousness of a 10-year-old weighing a real decision. Her small face screwed up in concentration, the way she looked when she was checking her own math twice. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and leaned sideways, without any ceremony at all, until her head came to rest against Elena's arm. "Okay," she said, and went back to her drawing as if nothing enormous had just happened, though something enormous plainly had. Elena sat very still for a moment after that, one hand resting on Sophie's hair, her eyes bright in a way she would not have allowed herself in front of anyone she thought was watching. She did not know Nathan was in the doorway. He stood there a moment longer, his chest doing something no safety calculation could explain, watching the two people he loved most in the world settle against each other like they had been doing it for years instead of months. He did not trust his voice yet, so he waited until it had steadied, and only then did he step back outside and knock, too loudly, on the trailer's open door, giving them both the courtesy of a warning before he came back in. Neither of them ever mentioned the moment to him directly, but something shifted after that evening, in small, quiet ways Nathan could not have named individually even if he tried. Sophie began saving her best drawings for Elena without being asked, no longer waiting for Elena to notice them first. Elena began arriving earlier than the site work required almost every week, no longer bothering to pretend, even to herself, that it was only about the drawings. And Nathan, watching the two of them grow steadily, unmistakably fond of each other, felt something in his own chest that he was not yet ready to name, except to admit, privately, that it frightened him exactly as much as it warmed him. What almost no one at Marsh Development knew, because Elena had spent 6 years making sure no one did, was that the woman photographed in business magazines as the sharp, composed young CEO rebuilding her father's company was underneath all of it, one of the loneliest people she knew. Elena had grown up watching her father build an empire and disappear into it. He had loved her, she believed that much, but he had loved the company first, and by the time Elena was old enough to understand the difference, she had already learned to measure her own worth the way he measured the company's, by performance, by results, by whether the numbers at the end of the quarter justified the person behind them. She had built her adult life on that same foundation. She worked constantly. She dated rarely, and never for long, because she could not shake the quiet, humiliating suspicion that anyone who wanted her wanted the company's CEO and not the woman underneath the title. She had, without ever quite deciding to, build a life with almost no one in it who saw her clearly. That was, she came to understand slowly over the fall, exactly what she recognized in Nathan and Sophie the first time she sat across from them in that trailer. It was not attraction, not at first. It was something quieter and more dangerous than that. It was recognition. Nathan, in his own careful, guarded way, was building a life around the one person who saw him without needing anything from him. Sophie was building her whole, small world around a father who never once made her feel like an obligation. Whatever frequency the two of them ran on, steady, warm, entirely unconcerned with what either of them looked like from the outside, matched something in Elena that had gone quiet a long time ago and had, until that fall, stopped expecting to be answered. She realized what was happening to her on an ordinary Thursday evening. Watching Nathan explain something to Sophie about the crane on the far side of the site, his hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder, both of them laughing at something Elena couldn't hear. She felt something in her chest that she recognized immediately and dreaded just as fast because she knew exactly what it was and exactly how much it could cost her. She was falling in love with Nathan Cole. It was, she thought, standing very still at the edge of the site, so neither of them would notice her watching, the single thing she had spent her whole adult life making sure never happened to her. She had watched what happened to people, to her father, mostly, when the thing they loved most became the thing that could actually hurt them. She had built her career, her reputation, her whole identity on being the one person in every room who did not need anyone. And here, in a construction trailer in the middle of the hardest project of her life, she had gone and needed someone anyway. She did not tell him. She told no one. She simply kept showing up earlier than her meetings required, kept sitting across from Sophie's drawings, kept working late beside Nathan over the same numbers, and told herself, the way people often do, that she was simply being thorough about the project. By late November, Marcus's campaign had gathered enough weight that the board scheduled a formal vote on Elena's leadership. It would depend on the results of an independent audit into the foundation problem. Nathan asked Dr. Priyo Anand, his old mentor, the engineer who had taught him 20 years earlier that honesty in this profession isn't a personality trait. It's a discipline practiced carefully every single time to help him trace the paper trail. They found it in 6 days. A revision log, a chain of internal emails, a report that had been filed and never passed along. All of it pointed to one conclusion, with the same clean certainty as a finished calculation. Marcus Webb had known about the foundation shortfall 18 months before Nathan ever set foot on the site, and he had chosen, alone, to bury it. Nathan brought the file to Elena the night before the board vote. She read through it in silence at her desk, and for the first time since he'd known her, her face was completely open. Not the composed CEO, not the careful negotiator. Just a woman looking at proof that a man her father had trusted for 20 years had gambled with the safety of a building carrying her family's name, and with her own reputation besides. She set the papers down slowly and pressed both hands flat on the desk, as if steadying herself. "I could bury this," she said quietly. Nathan didn't think she meant it. He thought she needed to say it out loud, just to feel the weight of it before she let it go. Handle it privately. Let him resign quietly. Protect the company's name. "You could," Nathan said, "but the building doesn't care about the company's name. And I don't think you do either." "Not really." Elena looked up at him then, and for the first time Nathan saw something steady underneath all that exhaustion. The calm of someone who had finally found, at the bottom of an impossible decision, the one answer she could actually live with. "No," she said, "I don't." The boardroom felt different that morning before anyone had said a single word. Nathan arrived early and found the room already half full, the kind of silence in it that isn't really silence at all. The low scrape of chairs, papers being squared twice for no reason, coffee going cold in cups nobody was drinking. Board members who usually greeted each other on the way and kept their eyes on their own folders instead. Nathan understood that kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a room bracing for weight it hadn't decided yet whether it could carry. Marcus came in a few minutes later, and Nathan watched him do the thing people do when they have already rehearsed how they want to look. His jacket was buttoned. His folder was squared at the edge of the table, exactly parallel to its side, the way a man arranges the last thing he can still control. He shook 2 hands on his way to his seat, his smile a fraction too wide, too fast, gone almost before it landed. He did not look at Elena. He did not look at Nathan either, not yet, and Nathan understood that too. A man saving his first look for the moment he could make it count. Elena came in last, and she came in standing. She did not take her usual chair. She walked to the head of the table, set her folder down without opening it, and remained on her feet, one hand resting lightly against the table's edge, her weight settled evenly. Her shoulders set the way they had been the first morning Nathan met her on site. It was a small thing, staying on her feet in a room full of people seated, but Nathan understood it as its own kind of engineering. She wanted every person in that room to have to look up at her, to feel, in their own necks and shoulders, the small physical effort of being the one who had to look up rather than across. She had learned, somewhere in 6 years of being underestimated in rooms like this one, that posture was its own kind of argument, made before a single word was spoken. The room went quiet on its own, the way a site goes quiet just before a load test. Not because anyone asked for silence, but because everyone in it understood, without being told, that something was about to be tested. "I'm not going to open this with an agenda," Elena said. "I'm going to open it with a question. How many people in this room have read the geotechnical revision log from April, 18 months ago?" No hands went up. She had expected that. She nodded once, as if the silence itself were the first exhibit. "Neither had I, until 3 weeks ago," she said. "I'd like to walk you through what's in it." She laid out the evidence herself, start to finish, without softening a single fact. Marcus's decision to bury the updated soil report, the 18 months of silence that followed, the way he'd turned Nathan's honest review into an accusation against him rather than let the board see the number itself. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. She spoke the way Nathan calculated. Flatly, in order, letting each fact carry exactly its own weight and no more, so that by the time she reached the end, the room was doing the arithmetic along with her, arriving at the same total before she ever said it out loud. Nathan watched the board members as she spoke, and watched something shift in the room with every new document she placed on the table. One woman near the far end, a longtime friend of Elena's father, had her pen resting against her lower lip, perfectly still, her eyes moving from page to page with the focus of someone rereading a number to make sure she hadn't misread it the first time. Another board member, older, silver-haired, had gone very rigid in his chair, jaw set, the particular stillness Nathan recognized from himself. The stillness of a man absorbing a fact he didn't want to be true. By the time Elena reached the final email in the chain, the one in which Marcus had explicitly instructed a junior engineer to route the revised soil report to his own desk and no one else's, nobody in the room was looking at their folders anymore. They were looking at Marcus. Marcus didn't deny any of it once the documents were on the table. He sat very still, both hands flat on the arms of his chair, his knuckles pale where his fingers pressed into the leather, watching his own leverage disappear piece by piece, the way a structure looks in its last moment before it fails. Not dramatic, just suddenly, quietly, without anything left to hold it up. "I built half of what this company is," he said finally, to the room, not to Elena. His voice had lost the practiced confidence from the meeting 3 weeks earlier. It came out smaller now, almost surprised at itself. Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You did," she said, "and you nearly destroyed the other half. Try to protect your place in it. Those two things aren't in conflict, Marcus. That's exactly the problem." The silver-haired board member was the first to speak into the silence that followed, and Nathan understood, listening to him, that this was the moment the vote was actually decided, hours before anyone raised a hand. 18 months, the man said, not to Marcus, but to the table in general, turning the number over like he still didn't quite believe it. "You had 18 months to bring this forward, Marcus. Not 18 days. 18 months. And instead of a memo, we got a newspaper story calling this young woman incompetent and her engineer a fraud." He shook his head slowly. "I've known you 20 years. I did not know you had that in you." The woman with the pen set it down at last and folded her hands the way Elena's had been folded weeks earlier. Not calm, Nathan understood now, recognizing the gesture, but held. "It isn't the soil report that decides this for me," she said quietly. "Soil reports get revised. Mistakes happen on every job I've ever funded. What decides it is that when the mistake surfaced, one of you tried to bury it a second time, and the other one put it on this table herself, knowing exactly what it would cost her to do it." She looked at Elena for a long moment. "That's not a hard choice for me to make. I'd like to withdraw the leadership review from today's agenda and move directly to a vote on Mr. Webb's position instead." Nobody objected. There were a few more questions after that, procedural ones, quiet ones, the kind boards ask not because they're still undecided, but because they need the record to show they did their diligence. Marcus answered what he could, in a voice that had gone flat and distant, a man reading his own obituary. Nathan watched Elena the whole time, still standing, still steady, her hand no longer resting on the table, but hanging loose at her side, and understood that whatever this cost her personally, she was going to let it cost her in front of everyone rather than hide any part of it in a private hallway conversation afterward. The board voted that afternoon, not against Elena, but against Marcus unanimously. Marsh Development opened an internal investigation that would, within the month, refer the matter to outside counsel to evaluate the company's liability and to the Florida Contractor Licensing Board, since it was the firm's own construction license, not any single engineers, that had been put at risk. Nathan felt no triumph watching it happen. Mostly he felt relief, the quiet, physical settling of a structure finally released from weight it was never built to carry. Once the real shape of the problem was out in the open, the engineering fix turned out to be simple, in a way honest problems usually are once people stop pretending there's something else. Nathan proposed underpinning, driving extra support piles at the weak points beneath the existing foundation until every pile under Meridian Tower could carry the load the current design actually demanded, not just the load an outdated soil report once assumed. It cost more than the original plan. It cost far less than finding a crack in the building after people had already moved in. Nathan spent 3 weeks of late nights in that trailer with Elena's engineering team, checking the same numbers from every direction he could think of until he trusted them the way he trusted very little in the world. Elena stayed most of those nights, too. Not because the numbers needed her, Nathan came to realize, but because she didn't want to be anywhere else. They worked in a silence that felt easy in a way silence rarely does between two people who are technically still just colleagues. The kind of ease that only comes after two people have already seen the worst version of each other's judgment and found something worth trusting on the other side of it. It was on one of those nights, past midnight, both of them bent over the same drawing, that Elena finally said it out loud. She set down her pencil and turned to face him. "You know, you could have let this ruin me," she said. "Politically, I mean, if you just stayed quiet instead of pushing for the audit." "I don't know how to stay quiet about a number that's wrong," Nathan said. "I never have. It's probably my worst quality." Elena looked up at that, and something crossed her face he hadn't seen there before. Not the composure she wore for boards and investors. Something quieter, more open, and immediately guarded again, as if she'd let a door swing wide for a second longer than she meant to. "I think," she said, "it might be my favorite thing about you." Nathan didn't answer right away. He had learned, since Rachel, to be careful with moments like that one, to check them from every angle before he trusted them to hold any weight. But he looked at Elena Marsh, sitting across a folding table covered in calculations, her head tilted slightly, her hands finally still on the page between them, and he understood something. Somewhere in the last 2 months, without ever deciding to, he had let himself feel something he hadn't let himself feel in 4 years. "It might be my favorite thing about you, too," he said. "The part where you didn't bury it. Most people would have." "Most people," she said, with the first real smile Nathan had seen from her all week, "haven't met your daughter." Meridian Tower topped out the following spring, more than a year later, on a clear morning with the kind of hard blue sky over Biscayne Bay that makes a finished building look less like a structure and more like an argument that had finally been one. The topping off ceremony brought out the same investors who had once circled cautiously. Only now they arrived without any caution at all. Elena's honesty through the whole Marcus Webb affair had done what no press release ever could. It made her, in the eyes of people who move money for a living, someone whose numbers could be trusted even when the numbers were bad. Sophie came to the ceremony wearing a small hard hat Elena had ordered for her weeks before, standing between the two adults at the edge of the rooftop with the pride of a kid who has decided a building belongs partly to her. Nathan watched Elena watch his daughter take in the whole city below them, and he understood, with the same plain clarity he usually saved for load calculations, that he was looking at the beginning of something he had stopped believing he would ever have again. Once Sophie had wandered off toward Dr. Anand to ask her something about the crane, Nathan turned to Elena. I used to think the whole point of a safety margin was to make sure nothing ever moved, he said. That stillness was the goal. Rachel's illness taught me that stillness isn't actually something anyone gets to keep, no matter how carefully you plan for it. So for 4 years, I think I built my whole life the way I build a foundation, trying to make sure nothing would ever be asked to move again. And now, Elena asked. Under her calm, Nathan could hear something that sounded a great deal like the openness she had let slip just once over the drawings that night. Now I think the goal was never stillness, Nathan said. I think it was backup. Enough support in enough places so that when one part of your life shifts, and it always does, the rest can hold. I spent 4 years building a life with just enough support and nothing more, because I couldn't stand to build in more than I needed in case I lost it again. And now, she said again, quieter this time. Now I'd like to build in some backup, Nathan said. If you'll let me. Elena was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city instead of at him. Nathan recognized that pause. The same one he went through before he committed to a number, the same one he now understood they had both been going through about each other for months without ever saying so. What he could not see, because she had spent 6 years learning how not to show it, was the small, private battle happening behind her stillness. A woman who had promised herself for years that she would never need anyone this much, finally deciding to lose that particular argument. I don't know how to be someone's backup, she said finally. I've spent my whole life being the one thing holding everything up. Alone. Nobody's asking you to hold anything up alone, Nathan said. That's really the whole point I'm trying to make. Badly. Elena laughed then. A real laugh. Unguarded. The same kind Nathan had heard only once before, over Sophie's bridge drawing. Her shoulders dropped, some tension he'd watched her carry since that first gray Tuesday morning finally letting go. Ask me properly, she said, stepping a little closer. You're an engineer. I assume you don't do anything without a proper plan. Elena Marsh, Nathan said. I'd like to propose a permanent arrangement, sharing the load between your life and mine. Built with backup, spread out, strong enough to hold under conditions neither of us can fully predict. I can't promise you exactly how it turns out, but I've checked the numbers as carefully as I know how. And I trust them. That, she said, stepping close enough now that the wind off the unfinished tower caught the edge of her jacket, might be the strangest proposal I've ever heard. Is that a yes? It's an approval, she said, and there was real warmth in it now. Plain and unmistakable. The warmth of someone who has done the math one last time and decided to trust the answer completely. Fully certified. Below them, Sophie turned away from the crane and Dr. Anand's patient explanations. She caught sight of the two of them standing close together at the edge of the roof, and she didn't look surprised at all, only satisfied. The way a kid looks when a building she's watched go up for months is finally, visibly finished. Took you guys long enough, she called up, loud enough that half the ceremony probably heard her, and Elena laughed again, and Nathan found he was laughing too, for what felt like the first time in 4 years without that low, cold weight sitting underneath it. Nathan Cole had always trusted numbers more than he trusted people. He still did, mostly. It wasn't a habit he expected to unlearn, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. But standing on the roof of Meridian Tower that morning, with his daughter's approval ringing out over a finished building, and Elena's hand finding his without either of them quite deciding to reach for it, he understood something he had missed in every calculation he'd run since Rachel died. The numbers were never the opposite of trusting people. They were only ever the discipline he brought to it. The refusal to build on something he hadn't checked, the insistence on finding out, honestly, what a thing could actually hold before he let himself lean on it. Elena Marsh, he had found, could hold quite a lot. And for the first time in a very long time, so it turned out, could he.